This is Tyler, your antisocial critic and the host of the AntiSocial Network, your number one source for anachronistic conversations online. Come join us each week to hear opinions from some of the best voices discussing entertainment, politics, religion, and modern life on the internet today, most of which you've never heard of, but I have. This week we're joined by Crystal Downing, the co-director of the Marion Wade Center at Wheaton College, and an expert on the Inkling, specifically of Dorothy Sayers. How's it going today?
It's going fine, although I have to interject, Dorothy Sayers technically wasn't an Inkling. But okay. Other than that, I am a specialist on Sayers.
Okay, what would you call her then? I mean, she was at not Wheaton. She was at Oxford around the time that Lewis and Tolkien were doing their thing. So would you call her?
Not really. She pretty much, after growing up, she was born in Oxford, but then her father, who was a rector, got a different job more in the Cambridgeshire area. And then she went to Oxford University. She's 5 years older than C.S. Lewis. But after that, after a stint in France, where she was working at a school, she lived in London and outside of London almost all her life. So the Inklings was a gathering of Oxford professors, and it was all male, but it was C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, Charles Williams, and Barfield, who are four of our authors. But Sayers never attended an Inklings meeting. In fact, the Inklings almost had this unspoken rule that women weren't part of the conversation, so that when C.S. Lewis started bringing his new wife to the Inklings, there was a certain tension. But all that to say that Dorothy Sayers was a very significant person in the life of C.S. Lewis. When he was several months before he died, he was asked to name some of the most important influences on his spiritual life. And he named only four, one of them being Dorothy Sayers. And we have this great conversation with C.S. Lewis's stepson. So this Joy Davidman, who he married, was a divorcee who had these two sons, which Lewis adopted. And the stepson visited us here at the Wade Center in Wheaton and told us the very first time he ever saw his stepfather, C.S. Lewis, cry is when Lewis heard of Sayers' death.
When did she die relative to his death?
She died in 1957. He died in 1963.
Okay, I didn't know how much proximity there was to that, but I mean, so you obviously your specialization is at the Wade Center has been studying her. Why have you been drawn to her so deeply? To put such focus on her?
Well, my husband is an internationally known C.S. Lewis scholar. He is the first person in history to get a critical analysis of C.S. Lewis published by a secular university press. That is quite significant. And so when we were both teaching, once I finished my PhD, he got his PhD before I did, trying to find jobs for two PhDs is where you can live near each other is not easy, because most colleges and universities, they put out an announcement that they want someone who specializes in a particular area. So being a professor, you can't choose where you live. You have to go where the jobs in your specialization are. And so we were both able to find jobs in Pennsylvania, and we got our PhDs in California at different University of California campuses. So once we were in Pennsylvania, it was so much easier to get to the Wade Center in Chicago. From California, it was just, especially from Santa Barbara where we lived, it was just an all-day trip. And David had already written an award-winning book on C.S. Lewis, and he heard about this place called the Wade Center. This was back in the 90s. And he said, well, Crystal, I would like to go there and do some original research. You can just come along and be my research assistant. And I said, no, I'm going to have my own project. And so I just said, well, there's only one woman. I want to explore who is this one woman among the 7 authors at the Wade Center. What is it that makes her so significant, especially in the early part of the 20th century, where opportunities for women weren't that great. In fact, here is just an annoying statistic. Sayers graduated from, went to Oxford University. She got one of the most prestigious scholarships to go there. She outperformed most of her male peers by getting highest honors in her field. In fact, it took Tolkien 3 different tries to pass the exams out of Oxford, and Sayers passed with flying colors. But in 1915, when she finished her studies, she was not given a degree because they thought, well, women don't need degrees because all they're going to do is work with children, either as mothers or teachers. So the fact that Sayers was able to surmount so many impediments to getting attention as a woman is pretty impressive. And that's what I wanted to explore.
I was going to say, it's interesting that you both wound up there. I wasn't sure if you guys had wound up there in different times or if you guys got married and then went there. So it was kind of funny. It's like it seems kind of like a match made in heaven that, your husband is this amazing...
Yes, well, yeah. But when you have a healthy marriage, you're constantly talking with each other about your interests. And so that led to, because David needed to do more research, and he's written like 6 or 7 books on C.S. Lewis, including a novel that includes C.S. Lewis and Tolkien that has been recently reissued. That just encouraged me to start doing research. And so my first book, which was helped me get tenure at the college where I was teaching in Pennsylvania, I made it on Dorothy Sayers because I was doing all this original archival research at the Wade. And then that book got an international award. So our names became known, but we just help each other by sharing what we're learning. And right now, I'm reading The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis, which I have never read before. But David and I have a podcast. It's called, the Wade Center Podcast. And so we're doing a conversation on the problem of pain, and I'm really enjoying it because Sayers recommended the problem of pain over and over and over again. So because Lewis influenced Sayers and Sayers influenced Lewis, it is a match made in heaven. So David and I influence each other like Sayers and Lewis.
What books have you written on Sayers then?
My very first book is called Writing Performances, The Stages of Dorothy L. Sayers. And it talks about the different stages she went through as a writer. And part of it, she had to go through various stages because of the impediments in terms of the respectability given to women, and also her love of performance, which then not only is manifest in her interest in theater, which she had her whole life, but also the performativity of language. How does language itself shape the way we view reality? So that's the subject of my first book. And it's a typical first book by a recent PhD in that I'm trying to show off how knowledgeable I am of arcane theorists like Jacques Derrida and Lacan and Lyotard, post-structuralism, semiotic theory. So I had to get that out of my blood. But again, it won the International Dorothy Sayers Society granted it an award as the best scholarship on Sayers. And that was wonderful because they paid for us to fly to England, and they put us up and gave me an award. And yeah, it was lovely. So then I wrote 3 more books inspired by Sayers, and I quote Sayers, but I'm really interested in the relationship between Christ and culture. And so my book that was just released almost exactly a year ago is called Subversive: Christ, Culture, and the Shocking Dorothy L. Sayers. So I have made a specialty the relationship between Christianity and culture. So my 4th book is on film and is called Salvation from Cinema, the Medium is the Message. And it's about the relationship between film and religion in general. When I got the contract, and a very respectable publisher, Routledge, they said, well, we really think this book could be a significant textbook in universities around the country, but we would want you to also discuss other religions besides Christianity in it. And that seemed fair because there are some of the highest quality films I've seen have come out of Israel and China and India. And so I needed to talk about the religious assumptions behind those films. So I did expand it, and the publisher was exactly right. It's now a textbook in religion and film courses around the country. So now I have a chance. I'm writing my 6th book where I am talking about specifically film and just Christianity, using Sayers' interest in film to guide me. So I'm calling it, I love this title, and I can't take credit for it. My husband suggested it, but it's so good, I have to share it. The Wages of Cinema, looking through the lens of Dorothy L. Sayers. And she was very interested in film. One of the things she did after Oxford University is she started writing screenplays. Now, this is for silent cinema, so they called them scenarios because obviously there's no talking parts in silent film. But you have to write the titles that are inserted in silent film. And she loved cinema. Nobody has talked about this because in the 4 volumes, so almost 2,000 pages of published letters by Dorothy Sayers, the editor left out all the letters where Sayers exuberantly talks about film. She does include the letters where Sayers puts down a film, but she never includes anything about Sayers praising film, talking about film. So this is wonderful for me because I have access to all this unpublished material in order to communicate something most even Sayers scholars don't know about. So how can this amazing woman who brought thousands of people to Jesus Christ in the 1940s, how can she help Christians look at film in more artistically responsible ways? Unfortunately, many Christians reduce film to a content delivery system. They don't value it as an art form. And so that is my emphasis, and Sayers is also about the importance of art.
Well, that's different from the Inklings proper, because the Inklings kind of have that reputation of being, not full Luddites, but gentle ones. And they they don't really talk about cinema all that much. I mean, they're very literature oriented, and they talk about music occasionally, but very rarely do they talk about cinema in any sort of positive way. The only time I think I've ever heard Lewis talk about film was when he talked about how much he hated Snow White.
Right. I just published an article about King Kong. King Kong was one of the few movies that C.S. Lewis saw. And so I'm talking about different instantiations of King Kong and how it relates to film theory. But you're exactly right. And that explains why all the letters about film, positive letters about film, have been left out of the published letters of Sayers, because in that generation of Oxford University professors, film was looked down upon as just kind of superficial entertainment. And film really didn't come into its own until the French New Wave started emphasizing the artistry of film. And the French New Wave kind of coincides with Dorothy Sayers' death. And so I talk about this, how the transition and attitudes about film developed over time. Although there are many film theorists who, and one, a psychologist of art, who as late as the year that Sayers died, 1957, asserted that film reached its apex as an art form in the silent era. And a lot of people recognize this. When sound came in, it degraded film because the technology was so crummy. So I explored that, but I understand why the Inklings didn't discuss film, especially the film that was coming out while the Inklings were meeting. They weren't meeting during the height of silent cinema. And Sayers herself, how she got an income and a reputation was through another popular form that most university professors would poo-poo, and that's detective fiction. And as Sayers once talked about this woman who denounced her for being a Christian, Sayers wrote Lewis and said, well, the trouble is she can't stand me because I believe in God and my books sell. If you're a best-selling author, if you write something popular, so whether it's movies or detective fiction, the intellectual elite look down on you. And so this person who collected Sayers' letters, she was bred with that same mindset, and that's why she didn't want people to know how much Sayers loved film. She wanted to prove to us that Sayers was an intellectual. And I understand that. We all have our own prejudices, our own passions. Like I have a passion for film, and hence I am using Sayers, employing Sayers' perspectives to help Christians be more responsible viewers of film.
I mean, I've heard the same allegation about with regards to like Barbara Tuchman, like historical novels and stuff, that the Academy doesn't like anything that's successful financially. So
yes, they get very suspicious of it. Because, and there is a certain truth to the fact that if you are being very scholarly and precise and nuanced, that isn't going to sell to a mass market. But it might be a totally original scholarship. Well, the same thing happened to Lewis. Once he became a Christian and started writing Christian fiction, like the Ransom trilogy and, of course, the Narnia Chronicles, he was looked down on at Oxford University. I mean, he wasn't promoted to full professor because, he wrote that popular Christian fiction. And that's why he went to Cambridge, because Cambridge recognized the quality of his scholarship. So Lewis was a victim of academic snobbery as well. And of course, Tolkien too, he kind of hid his hobby working on the Lord of the Rings just for decades. And if it hadn't have been for Lewis, Tolkien would never have published Lord of the Rings. And it was Lewis who said, you've got to publish this, you've got to publish this, this is good stuff. But I think part of it is that Tolkien recognized the Academy did not respect popular fiction.
So, popular fiction aside, what is Dorothy Sayers most known for nowadays in terms of her overall work? Because it seems like she's done a lot of things.
Right, and that's why my first book was subtitled The Stages of Dorothy L. Sayers. And of course, there's a pun in the word stages, theatrical stages, but then also stages in her fiction. Well, of course, she became known all through England for her Lord Peter Wimsey detective stories. She was a founding member of the very prestigious London Detection Club. She was elected president before Agatha Christie ever was. In her own day, people respected Sayers more than Agatha Christie. And then this dramatic transition happened in her life in 1936. So she published her first detective novel she wrote it in 1921, had trouble, as many people do with first novels, didn't get published till 1923. So that was the first Lord Peter Wimsey detective novel. And then while she was writing her last couple of novels, writing her last novel, she was asked to write a play to be performed in Canterbury Cathedral. And this was a very prestigious commission, because 2 years before, the play that was performed in Canterbury Cathedral was by T.S. Eliot, Murder in the Cathedral. And of course, T.S. Eliot was one of these modernist idols. Now, he is the great intellectual. And so Sayers herself thought, oh, Eliot is considered this great intellectual. I'm just a best-selling detective fiction novelist. How could I possibly follow in the footsteps of T.S. Eliot? And but she thought about it and decided to try it. And it changed her life. She wrote a play called The Zeal of Thy House, and in it started theorizing the theology of creativity and the theology of the integrity of work. And what it did is it re-energized her own faith. So she was the daughter of a Anglican rector. She never renounced her faith growing up, but she kind of compartmentalized it. She was just pretty much annoyed by the pietism and or legalism of Christians that she ran into. And so I think she's like a lot of youth today that have grown up in the church, but they won't renounce their Christianity, but it's not going to be a major focus of their life. So she knew enough about Christianity that when she started writing this play for Canterbury Cathedral, The Zeal of Thy House, it forced her to really get back and think about Christian topics. And it provided a revolutionary theology where she is arguing that when basically Genesis, she doesn't argue in a play, but the play suggests this, that in Genesis 1:27, when it says that humans are created in the image of God, well, that verse is in the first chapter of Genesis. What is God like in the first chapter of Genesis? God is a creator. God isn't a lawgiver. God isn't a judge. God isn't a redeemer. God is creator. And then we're told that humans are created in God's image. So for Sayers, that means we fulfill the image of God when we are creative. And what she does then, this is pretty subversive idea. This is why I call my book subversive. I mean, people had just never thought this way before. And she went on from there, and this is the last part of her play where she has an angel talking about this as part of the play, saying that not only is creativity the imago Dei, but creativity is triadic, endorsing the Christian idea of a Trinitarian God. So she's basically saying creativity reinforces the truth of Christianity. Theologians were blown away by this, and they recognized something totally new. And one theologian encouraged her to develop her idea and explain it in a more literary critical text. And so she did that in a book called The Mind of the Maker, where she explains her Trinitarian idea of creativity, which C.S. Lewis describes in his book Miracles as an extremely important book. So Lewis recognized the importance of this. Well, in the meantime, now I'm finally getting, those are all important things, but what made her really popular to the point of a pariah is that while she was writing The Mind of the Maker about her Trinitarian aesthetic, she was working on a series of radio plays about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And this also resulted from the play, The Zeal of Thy House. And BBC Radio, Sears' play was very popular. It went on to tour England, it was performed in the West End, even though it's a Christian play, West End, London. So BBC Radio said, oh, wow, she's writing plays now. Let's ask her to write plays, radio plays. So it's performed by many voices. So she was asked in 1940. Sayers spent a year rereading the Gospels in the original Greek, no less, because she wanted to be accurate to the Gospels. But she also wanted to make the Gospels come alive for her audiences. So she had the disciples speaking slang, which they probably did. The disciples were working class, right? And so when the first radio play was ready to be performed, and it was, you can do the math for me. It was actually 1941. So it's like, would that be 80 years ago? Exactly 80 years ago, this month, Sayers held a press conference set up by the BBC to advertise her plays, and she read from one of the plays. And journalists who were at the press conference picked up on the fact that Sayers did not use King James English for the disciples, or even Jesus at times, and plastered it as headlines in the papers. Plays about Jesus in slang. And the trouble is, some of it was American slang. So one headline was plays about Jesus in American slang. Christians all over England were appalled. They set up a censorship campaign. They wrote letters to Winston Churchill and the Archbishop of Canterbury demanding these plays be taken off the air. Sayers got hate mail from Christians. She got nasty phone calls. She got one postcard from someone addressing her, "You nasty old sourpuss." She was pretty feisty. She had to have been feisty, being a woman when who succeeded when she did. And she refused to back down. despite all the hate mail. This was even discussed in Parliament. This controversy that was going all over England because of Dorothy Sayers. And so what happened is that thousands of people who would never normally listen to religious broadcasting, they tuned in because they thought, ooh, this is a scandal. They wanted to hear what this, the scandal. And so I think they probably assumed that this Dorothy Sayers was demythologizing scripture or something, but she doesn't. She shows, Jesus's miracles, the resurrection, she basically follows the Gospels. It's just not in King James English. And she inserts transitional incidents, as you would in any theater, to get from one parable to another, but all consonant with the gospel message. So anyway, thousands of people tuned in who wouldn't normally. And I can say thousands because Dorothy Sayers wrote C.S. Lewis a letter telling Lewis that she herself got thousands of letters. That's Sayers' word. She got thousands of letters from people saying, thanks to your radio plays, I finally understand the relevance of Jesus to my slang-slinging life. Thanks to your radio plays, I've started reading the Bible. Thanks to your radio plays, I have gone back to church. Thousands of people came to Christ because Sayers was more committed to the truth than what she called the idolatry of language. And this still happens today, where people make idols out of their interpretations and their human interpretations of Scripture, rather than allowing the Holy Spirit to speak to them through Scripture. So that really took her popularity into another direction. And she never published another detective novel. She got so many requests to speak and write about theological topics. And so she started writing more theological plays. She actually wrote one play about the First Ecumenical Council at Nicaea in 325 AD. I mean, she was committed to get people to think about the truth of Christianity, but to think about it in new ways rather than cliched, pietistic, unenergizing ways.
Okay, there's a lot of it. What about we didn't talk about her translation work on top of that too?
Oh yeah, that was late in life, and partly. So these BBC radio plays about the life of Jesus, it's called The Man Born to be King. And even after people were praising them, one Christian actually, when the third play was broadcast in the second week of February 1942, which is the week that the Japanese attacked Singapore, which was, of course, British, that Christian wrote an article for the paper saying that the fall of Singapore to the Japanese was God's retribution for Dorothy Sayers' radio plays about Jesus.
Oh my.
I mean, it's just appalling. But again, you see people using the name of Christ today to support appalling political issues. And I have a whole chapter in my book, Subversive, that I call The Politics of Religion, the Religion of Politics, and how unfortunately Christians today are like the Christians that Sayers had to deal with, where what you see is, rather than saying, for me to live is Christ, it's for me to live is my party's political platform. And I use Christ as a prop to hold it up, which, of course, is blasphemy and heresy. So then, as the war got worse, and Sayers was living right outside London, And during one bomb scare, she had to run to the bomb shelter that they had in their backyard. And she just grabbed a copy of Dante's Inferno in Italian. She had already read Charles Williams' book, The Figure of Beatrice, and really loved that book and started an interaction with Charles Williams. So Charles Williams, who is one of our authors at the Wade, got Sayers to helped Sayers become enamored of Dante. And so she had to read something in the bomb shelter. You're there for hours waiting for the sirens to go, the all clear sirens. And she was really good at languages. So her degree at Oxford and she got the highest honors in modern languages. So she just taught herself Italian while she was reading Dante. And she realized that just as The Man Born to Be King touched lives because she made the language understandable to contemporary audiences, she felt like, wow, this Dante guy is brilliant. He helps us think about Christianity in new ways, but I want to put it in more modern language. So there's kind of a continuity between Man Born to Be King and then the Dante project. But it was, that was a major project. So the last decade of her life really was spent working on translating the Inferno. So she finished the Inferno and then finished the Purgatorio, and she was partially done with the Paradiso when she died. But what's interesting is that along with her translation, she has notes, explanatory notes, because Dante is talking too about the politics of his day and how people use religious language to justify problematic political behavior. I mean, this is nothing new, what we're seeing in our own day. And so she wrote long introductions to the various books of the Divine Comedy. And those are so highly respected that when my nephew went to a secular state university and took a world literature class, the professor required the students to read all of Sayers' introductions and notes to the Divine Comedy. He said, this is the best that has been written yet. Sayers, this popular writer Christian. So she was a brilliant, brilliant woman. And so she could do high-level scholarship, as she did with Dante, but she was really committed to communication so that the regular person on the street could understand the gospel message, could understand Dante. So she made an amazing contribution. And the irony is what she thought was being very popular at her time. Now, I've run into people who they think even her Lord Peter Wimsey detective stories are too hard to understand. Because unlike Agatha Christie, who her novels are pretty formulaic, whereas Sayers gets into psychological subtlety, she gets into gender issues, she gets into real world analysis. And so it's kind of sad. I think that's why Sayers isn't as well known today. She's just too brilliant for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, the full breadth of her stuff makes it hard to summarize. I mean, and anyone who's has a career like that, it always kind of helps to be able to point at one thing and be like, this is what they're known for. Anyone can just pass out a copy of Screwtape Letters and you get C.S. Lewis's entire thing. But it seems like there's so much with Dorothy Sayers. Where do you recommend people start with? I actually just I have some options because I actually just stopped at. I think I told you the best bookstore when we met in the Wade Center a couple months ago. The best bookstore I ever met is on the campus of Purdue. And last year I went there and they had an entire spread of used Charles Williams books. And this past month I went there and they had a whole spread of Dorothy Sayers.
Yay!
Yeah, So I got Mind of the Maker, Man Born to Be King, and her translation of Inferno. Where do you generally recommend people to start with her work? Because it seems like there's a lot to kind
of from. Right. Well, I just think her own. I mean, my first book, I talk about her various stages, and I think it's interesting to follow her stages, to see her own development as a thinker and Christian. And what's significant is so I'll answer your question in a second. She is quite clear that Lord Peter Wimsey is not a Christian. He is not religious. And Sayers had no interest in preaching or Christianity in her Peter Wimsey novels. She does have a Christian detective inspector who is a friend of Lord Peter Wimsey, but he's pretty marginal, and she just kind of abandons him altogether when she invents a love interest for Lord Peter. So it's not like she was subtly trying to preach the gospel message. But I recommend people just start with her first novel, Whose Body? And many specialists in detective fictions recognize even that novel, which Sayers later poo-pooed. I mean, it was her first novel. It was, it's flawed, definitely. But specialists say she was already starting to challenge just the conventions of detective fiction. She herself was not someone who just liked following cliches, generic conventions. She really wanted to think about things. So I would just go chronologically with her novels, and then, I would read Man Born to Be King. And it's funny because the first couple times I read Man Born to Be King, because I'm so familiar with the gospel message, I just thought, yeah, this is the gospel message. And it's only as I really went through it with care and attention, because reading something is different than listening to a radio theatrical broadcast. These were stage actors that they got, one of whom was who was employed for a while and had a minor role was Richard Burton, the famous Richard Burton. But anyway, so there is a lot in Man Born to Be King, and I kind of unpack Man Born to Be King in my book, Subversive, and I think my book, Subversive, and this is what I intended, it has really helped people understand Sayers. It was actually, even though Subversive is showing and supporting Sayers' emphatic endorsement of Christian orthodoxy. It's all about getting back to the doctrine that was established in the first four ecumenical councils. This is the truth of Christianity. And of course, the first ecumenical council was before even the biblical canon was finalized. You need to go back to the people who are cementing doctrine, which helped shape the books that they chose to put into the Bible. And that's a Sayers argument. And of course, the problem with many Protestants is they don't study the history of Christianity. They don't study the history of the Bible even. They don't realize the word Trinity never even appears in the Bible. They don't realize the phrase personal relationship with Jesus is not in the Bible. So the irony is, and I discovered this as a Christian college professor, many people idolize the Bible, but they've never really read it. They don't really study what the Bible is saying. So anyway, and here my book, which was written just to help people understand Sayers, was selected by a secular venue, the Publishers Weekly. They chose it as a pick of the week when it was released. That's pretty amazing for secular people to be endorsing a book that celebrates Christian orthodoxy. But I think that happens, well, it's because of Sayers. It's not me, it's Sayers. Because they're just blown away by how this woman endorses Christianity, but she uses language that they've never heard before. And it forces people to think in radically new ways.
Just as a kind of, wrapping up question, what do you consider your favorite of her novels? Like, just as on a personal level, which one do you come back to the most?
No question, Gaudy Night. And that is the most subversive of all her detective novels because there's no dead body in it. The real mystery that needs to be solved in Gaudy Night is whether a woman in 1930s can balance a career and marriage. And that's the kind of meta mystery. It's just about a women's college, like the one Sayers went to at the Oxford University, where someone is doing all these vicious, destructive pranks. And Sayers' female character, Harriet Vane, has to figure out what's going on, who's doing it, and it's disrupting the university, or the college, definitely, but hurting the reputation of a women's college at Oxford University. It's a brilliant novel. Most people select as Sayers' best two detective fiction novels either Gaudy Night or Nine Tailors, which is about Lord Peter Wimsey participating in a bell ringing service to ring in the new year, and they discover a murdered body in the bell tower. So, but it's getting to what Sayers is really interested in terms of the integrity of work. For her, that is what she had the most passionate about, the integrity of her work. She didn't kowtow when Christians accused her of causing the fall of Singapore to the Japanese, because she was committed to the integrity of her work.
That's an amazing title, though, to have. She should just. I hope she framed that newspaper that said she caused the fall of Singapore. This is going on the wall of slander right here. I would love to have that newspaper, because that sounds amazing. But
yeah. Well, after the fact, you can enjoy it when you're accused of things like that. It's in fact, Sayers, how we know about the Nasty Sourpuss postcard is she wrote a letter to a friend saying, "I wish I had saved the postcard that called me a nasty old sourpuss, but it was so upsetting when I got it that I just tossed it out." And I can understand why. When you are attacked by people and your very character is impugned. I mean, Sayers went through a lot, but that's why she changed lives, because she was willing to suffer for the cause of Christ, basically.
Well, as my dad once said, time and distance makes things funny. So we can
yes,
laugh at it now.
Exactly.
So could you just to kind of wrap up, could you tell people where they can find you and your work, and where they can find the Wade Center stuff?
Sure. The Wade Center, which is the most comprehensive archive in the world for materials by and about Dorothy Sayers, and is the preeminent archive in the world for published and unpublished materials by and about C.S. Lewis and 6 of his influencers, and Sayers happens to be one of them. It is at the corner of Washington and Lincoln in Wheaton. It is open. Anybody can walk in for free between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. any weekday. We have the wardrobe that was in C.S. Lewis's house when he was growing up. We have the desk upon which Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. We have C.S. Lewis's desk upon which he wrote the Narnia Chronicles. So we have a fun museum, but then we also have a research area. And for free, if you have a research project, we will pull rare first editions for you. We have 2,500 books that were owned by C.S. Lewis that has his writing in the margins. And that is so fun because, wow, you know what C.S. Lewis really thought when you see what he wrote in the margins of books. Like we have one book where C.S. Lewis wrote in a margin, "This man is a fool." And of course, he would never publish something like that. But you go, oh, I think we really know C.S. Lewis's opinion here. So it's great for people.
I remember when I came there, you showed me his copy of Don Juan by Lord Byron.
Oh, yes.
And the end comment had the date he finished on it, and the only words were "never again."
Yes. That is so fun. And it's an amazing resource. And what surprises me is how people do not know about the Wade Center. So at the Wade Center, then, of course, my husband's book, my books, and just many very popular books about all of our 7 authors are on sale stationery that depicts our authors, things like that are available. So I encourage anybody just to stop by, just to see this amazing place.
I duly recommend that. It was I've been there twice, and it was a lot of fun both times. So.
Oh, good.
All right. Well, it was good to talk to you again, and I appreciate your time. I hope you have a good day.
Well, thank you so much, Tyler. This was great.
Sure. Have a good day, then.
Bye-bye.
The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions podcast. Editing, producing, and hosting are by Tyler Hummel. Artwork by Crystal Cowley. And original music was composed by Melissa Lafira and the late Dan Smolla. Like, subscribe, and please let us know what you think about the show in the comments below if you'd like to see anyone interesting be a guest on the show. Thank you for listening.